Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Adam Short, host of the Grit in the Wild podcast. Adam, it's good to be back, and today to hear more of your story, sometime in the past, it's been a few months ago, I had you share your story, and you and your wife came on, and there's so much more to tell. I kind of feel like with all the different groups that you've been involved with, we could have probably, 10, 15 different stories, but today we decided to go back and choose one that is fascinating to me, and I think the listeners would be very interested to hear more about it. So I'll let you run with it. But today is another Our Stories with Adam Short.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me back, John. Always a pleasure. And yeah, when you asked me about, which story, I was kind of like, all right, let's just roll the dice and pick one. Because I do have a few or several, depending on how you slice and dice. But really what came forefront to the top of my mind was to dive in a little more, hone in a little more about my involvement in Kansas City. So a lot of your listeners and viewers might be more familiar with my commentary on Bethel. And I was very much neck deep at Bethel. But prior to that, I was actually in Kansas City and not a direct member of IHOP, but I was a part of an organization, well, it's actually a church called Metro Christian Fellowship, which many of y'all will have heard of or been, are familiar with. Metro Christian Fellowship was originally founded by Mike Bickle back in early 80s-ish, I think late 70s actually. And at that time it was Kansas City Fellowship, KCF, and then it changed to Kansas City Vineyard, KCV, and then later down the line, it became known as Metro Christian Fellowship, MCF. So I was not there in the early days, back in like the 80s or 90s or anything like that. I actually moved to Kansas City in 2004. And so a little bit of the backstory, I'll kind of give some context here and then talk through some of my experience. So originally from the Carolinas, you can probably tell, not from Kansas City or California or any of those other spots that I've lived in. But yeah, from the Carolinas. But back in 2004, after I finished college, I was invited to go visit Kansas City to visit a very good friend of mine out there who had moved out there previously to be a part of a organization that was kind of pre-IHOP. It was known as Grace Training Center, and Grace Training Center was sort of a precursor, if you will, to IHOP, and it was more of a training organization. I did not have specific direct experience with Grace Training Center, but I knew several of the people who taught at Grace Training Center had overlap connections there. So through that series of events, I ended up moving to Kansas City specifically to join a program that was sort of housed under Metro Christian Fellowship. And it was a church planting organization, a missions organization. So that was my goal, was to eventually go out as a missionary and plant churches. And so, I moved to Kansas City. I had involvement informally with IHOPKC. I attended Metro Christian Fellowship during my 2 years living there, and then spent a lot of time at Metro. And again, a lot of the leaders at Metro also were leaders in the organization I was a part of, the missions organization called All Nations. And All Nations is still around. It's a missions organization. It sends out church planners throughout the world. And it was actually started by Floyd McClung, who was one of the top leaders of YWAM with Loran Cunningham way back a long time ago. So, I know I'm giving a lot of detail, but I'm trying to set the context here. Floyd, basically what happened was, so in 1999, around 99 to 2000 timeframe, Mike Bickle stepped away from Metro Christian Fellowship to start IHOP, right? And then Floyd, and I don't know all the details on the selection process, but Floyd McClung became the new pastor of Metro at that time. And so previous to coming to Metro, he had started All Nations, which is, like, as I said, a church planting / missions organization. So he started that before he came to Metro. And then when he came to Metro, he brought his All Nations organization with him, and then it became sort of under the Metro umbrella. They were separate organizations, but they shared a building off of Warrenall Road, 12411 Warrenall Road. I will never forget the address, Kansas City, Missouri. They no longer meet there because the church doesn't exist anymore in its current form, to my knowledge. But at that time, you had Metro in that building, you had All Nations in that building, and you also had the was it Dominion Christian School, if I'm remembering the name correctly. It was a Christian, early education school. So all that was in that building. So there was a lot of overlap there amongst the leaders, the members of the church, the members of the All Nations programs, and things like that. So there's a lot of overlap between what happened in that building and then what happened over on Red Bridge Road where IHOP was. So I got to Kansas City in 2004 to do the church planting school with All Nations. And I look back on All Nations, and I would not call All Nations a cult. Just to say that up front, I don't believe All Nations in and of itself is a cult. But I want to talk about how, because All Nations became sort of under the umbrella of Metro, it was built for many years on the foundation of Metro. Okay, and so the belief systems, the structure, the practices, I think fundamentally were built in a large part upon a cult. Because if you look at the overall history of Metro and the offshoots of Metro, i.e. KCF, KCV, from that church were many sprouts and offshoots and tributaries, if you will, that sort of emanated out of that church over the decades. And one of those offshoots, in my opinion, was All Nations. Now, if you look at All Nations as an organization and their ethos and compare it to IHOPKC, they're very different. They're very different. They had / very different missions, if you will. All Nations was a church planting organization that sent missionaries out all over the world, whereas IHOPKC was very much of an inward-focused, prayer room-based organization where people came into the prayer room to spend maximum amount of hours in prayer and worship. Okay, so two different types of outworkings of practical belief systems and things like that, but still very much built on the same foundation, I think.
So this is the early years that fascinate me. How it all came together, how it all came to be, and you're one of the few people who was in that is willing to open up and talk. So this for me, this is just fascinating, especially with concerns to my research. But what you're describing there, this is the doctrinal foundation that created what became IHOP. And I understand what you're saying about the two different entities with the two different mission types. What I'm really interested to know is some of the doctrinal framework that tied all of that together, because as you know, I'm certain you're aware, and anybody who is involved with it, this developed into spiritual abuse. And for something to go, I'm certain that in its inception, many of these groups had really good ambitions, good ideas, but slightly off in some doctrinal point that was a snowball going down a hill and became bigger until it exploded. What were the doctrinal themes that joined all these together? And specifically, I'm wanting to know, out of my own curiosity, was the Joel's Army a big theme back then, or had it changed later? Or what was your experience with regards to the doctrine, the Joel's Army framework, and what end times revival missions that IHOPKC had?
Yeah. Back then, because I was so heavily involved in All Nations and Metro too, like, I went to Metro as a church. I don't remember that being discussed, frankly, like in the day-to-day All Nations curriculum or belief systems or anything like that. Was it discussed or preached about at Metro? I don't remember. But I will say probably, well, no, let me go back a step, because before all that, I was a part of Morning Star. I've been in the trifecta. I was at Morning Star, then Kansas City, then Bethel and Redding. Okay. So, but back at Morning Star, there was talk about the Joel's Army, because Bob Jones was very involved back then at Morning Star, and he also was at IHOP too. So Bob Jones, I was exposed to Bob Jones and some of that Joel's Army stuff here and there, but not directly as much when I was in Kansas City. But later I was at Bethel. So that theme did sort of ride across all three movements that I was a part of there. But then, like, to your question, what were the doctrinal sort of beliefs? I think that under all of even though All Nations was more of a church planting oriented organization, it was still a charismatic, a charismatic group that believed a lot of the same things about prophecy, about the supernatural, and all that stuff. I think was pretty much came from the framework that Metro had, with a little bit of YWAM flair, because, remember Floyd McClung, and he's a very well-known, leader across YWAM. Anybody that was in YWAM would know Floyd McClung. He was almost as well-known as Loran Cunningham, prolific author, everything. So in that sense, I think Floyd brought his own sort of flavor / variation, if you will, of his charismatic sort of leanings. But I do think there are overlaps there amongst your doctrinal positions that people had, or those organizations had. I had no beef with Floyd. I knew Floyd, just to make that clear. Like, my abuse did not happen because of Floyd directly. It was some other people that I'm happy to get into some of that. But, like, just to your question, John, I think that would be my recollection of the Joel's Army. Like, not as much front and center in All Nations in Metro, but that's just going off my memory, which is probably not the most reliable.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Morning Star was so heavy into it back then, because I go back and forth. Who was the one who really brought this forward into IHOP? Was it Paul Cain that brought the Joel's Army? Was it Bob Jones? Was it a combination of the two? Or was it just simply Latter Rain in general, because this had kind of disseminated through Latter Rain? But sorry, I didn't mean to hijack your story. I'm just filled with questions trying to understand the early years. But it's fascinating, though. So, and you're mentioning YWAM. Jed and I are going through a bit of that history, because he was also involved in YWAM. And there are some very, very interesting connections to YWAM to all of my research as well. Much of which I haven't yet published. I'm getting there. But how much? So on the YWAM side, how familiar were you with their outreach programs? Were you actually actively going out with YWAM into other mission fields? What was your involvement there?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So YWAM was not officially, like, how do I say this? It was a separate organization, much, much larger than All Nations. However, because Floyd was an executive, very high up leader in YWAM for many decades, he had those connections to bring to the table when it came to building out All Nations as an organization. Okay, so I'll give you an example of what I mean. I knew lots of people who were in YWAM who did the DTS schools, discipleship training schools, and then they went on their outreach. I have friends that did that at the personal level. But then beyond that, as an organization, when I was actually a missionary with All Nations, I moved to France. I lived in France. And then later I lived in West Africa as a missionary. And during my time, both in Europe and Africa, because of the connections that Floyd and other leaders he knew in YWAM, right, because of that overlap, there was access to people and resources and facilities, locations, et cetera. So for example, I remember one time when I was living in France, there was a Europe event that All Nations had up in Lausanne, Switzerland. So basically what that means is all of the missionaries in Europe go to one spot and you have like a retreat. And so this was actually at a YWAM base. Beautiful property right on Lake Lausanne, overlooking the lake. But I just make that point because even though YWAM was a separate organization, there was a lot of relational connections that Floyd had that he was able to bring to the table and we had sort of informal access to those kinds of things, within All Nations. And the other thing I'll mention too is when it comes to teachers in the school that I was in, called CPX, Church Planning Experience, some of the teachers also were from YWAM. So there were other folks who came in on staff who I think had history in YWAM. So there was definitely a lot of overlap there for sure. But I didn't ever actually do YWAM formally, like outreach YWAM. Our approach in All Nations was very different than YWAM. YWAM is much more short-term missions organization where they send teams out for, 6 weeks or, 3 months or whatever it is. But what I was in a part of was much more long-term oriented of where you're going in. The goal is to plant churches long-term, not like a short-term missions trip.
That makes sense. And so when those groups came together and Mike Bickle is establishing his foothold in Kansas City, that made a good partnership because Mike didn't have the outreach. He was focusing on Kansas City and the two could come together. So I guess I understand that a good bit. Doctrinally speaking, what brought these multiple organizations together?
That is a great question that I don't know the answer to. I would love to know more about that. I would love to know, and I've seen some of the correspondence that was released publicly back in, well, it was actually released after 2005, but I was actually in Kansas City when this hubbub happened between Mike and Floyd. There was a big controversy, and a lot of this stuff's public. If you go dig it up, there were letters that multiple leaders of Metro wrote to Mike because it turns out there was actually some beef, I think, that happened between Mike and Floyd. When Mike left Metro and went to start IHOP, he sort of turned his back on any accountability. And even though his own church leaders were trying to, I think, bring accountability to the best they knew, even though at that time, as I understand it, none of those leaders were aware that he was, basically committing CSA against multiple people, 17 people now that we now know. But the beef that happened between Mike and Floyd became more public later. And you can kind of see some of the beliefs of how church governance was handled back then. There was definitely a rift between what Mike believed and what the leaders of Metro were trying to push, right, and hold him accountable to an extent. But he was just shunning that, as it turns out. And he's going to bail, jump ship, and go start IHOP and basically put that in the rearview mirror. Excuse me. But doctrinally specifically, I would like to know more about that too. I don't really feel like I have a good understanding on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been investigating many of the other connections, like the shepherding movement, got involved to some extent. And I've been studying John Wimber, his involvement, and interestingly, Wimber's brief involvement with the shepherding movement. It seemed as though a lot of these charismatic groups were trying to find their footing. So it could have been that they were just trying to try something new to see if it could spark. There's this mentality within the charismatic movement that if you can spark that revival, you can hasten the coming of Jesus. And so maybe they were attempting that. I'm not certain, but there's a whole element of that is just simply the charismatic movement, which could have brought it together. But fascinating and curious all at the same time. As you're talking, I'm taking mental notes so I can go research some of these areas further. Yeah, no, you're giving me ideas too to research further. I want to answer those questions too. This is part of my deconstruction journey and reconstruction, peeling back the layers, putting it all on the chopping block, and then like trying to figure out what parts of this do we just need to throw away, and what part we need to keep. And that's just a never-ending drama, at least in my head. But I guess moving from there, just to kind of speak to my experience and really the nitty-gritty of what happened in my personal life. So I was in Kansas City a couple of years there, and then once you go through the school, once people went through the All Nation School, then the next step for a lot of people was to actually be sent out as a missionary, and that's what I did. And I was really fortunate at that time from the standpoint of support, like both financial and spiritual support. I had like 4 or 5 churches who, sponsored me as a missionary and sent me out and financially, contributed to what the work that I was going to do over in Europe and Africa. So what happened was I, through a whole story I won't get into right now, I became acquainted with a pastor in West Africa, an African pastor. And this was after I had been in France, and made the decision to transition and move to Africa. So I began getting to know this pastor in Africa. And, and just to kind of provide a backdrop, this person was, as I look back now, a very grandiose person. This person was very, very, just always talking about these visions and dreams and encounters that he had, the supernatural encounters. He had all of these stories of just things that would blow your mind, right? Like, I'll give you an example. And truthfully, like, I still try to understand if some of this stuff is true. I witnessed some of this stuff with my own 2 eyes in Africa, things that I cannot explain, that do not logically make sense whatsoever. And I'm going to share one of those. But before I do, let me say this. This pastor would tell stories about when, he was preaching in this certain village. I can't remember where right now, but he told this story multiple times where people were starving. And so he said, I prayed, and, it rained, and there were all these water puddles on the ground, and fish started jumping out of the puddles. Okay. And people went and collected buckets and buckets and buckets of fish, and they were able to eat. And I'm hearing these stories, and this is a guy, you're talking about somebody who came from a supernatural background. Like, I was at Morning Star. I had a grid for miracles. I had an encounter. I met the Lord in an encounter by myself when I was a teenager. So here I am in front of a pastor, working with a pastor in Africa, along with another missionary. And he's telling these stories. And I'm like, okay, this is so out of my realm of normal that I don't know what to do with this, but it sounds plausible. It sounds real. I don't have any reason to doubt what he's saying.
But very, very soon after arriving in Africa, people talk about they sensed something was wrong. Okay. And that was exactly what happened with me. It was actually, I pulled up my journal from back then, that was 2007. And I remember in the first week, I had written in there that I had very, very serious concerns, and I was very uncomfortable with it's just intuitively, you know that something's wrong. But see, my optimistic outlook on faith and sort of a supernatural, like miracles and all that stuff, I pushed that down. I pushed it down. I said, no, let's just give this some time. I'm sure this will work out just fine. But it didn't. It didn't work out. It got worse. It got worse, and it got worse. I discovered that this man was a very unsafe person. And it wasn't just spiritual stuff. It was like, this is hard for me to talk about. I've not really talked about this publicly, so y'all bear with me. I was very afraid of this man. And if he was so controlling that if you did not do things exactly how he wanted you to do, he would go into fits of rage. He would lay into you. I mean, he would just, you would you would get chewed out and verbally abused, verbally berated. And so I began to get used to this type of treatment on a regular basis. And because he had a lot of stature in this country, he knew the president. We went and we met high level leaders in the country that he knew. He was very connected politically. Not many people in the United States follow West African politics, so none of the names that I would mention would mean anything to most people. But I will tell you that he was very well connected. And so here I am. I'm just a little nobody, right? Like I'm a little bitty nobody person in Africa here trying to plant a church. And what I was taught is you submit to the pastor, and this is even before I was exposed to Bethel's honor culture. But even at that point, I knew that, okay, what you're supposed to do here is you're supposed to listen to what the pastor says, honor the culture that's hosting you, and just, basically do what you're told. So that's what I try to do. But the more this went on, the more I felt the insides of me were collapsing. My spiritual framework, my relationship with God was literally being destroyed. I remember feeling like I could hear the voice of God on a daily basis, but as time went on, living in Africa under his leadership, that totally just went away. Like I didn't know where God was. I felt like I had been abandoned, and here I am with a unsafe, unpredictable spiritual leader who not only treats me that way, but he treats everybody else that way too. Everybody in his churches. So, and there were multiple church locations. We would go all over the area, preaching in the churches. And you have to understand, in Africa, in this part of Africa, there is an awareness of the spirit realm very much unlike here in the West. And I don't care what you believe about the spirit realm. I'm going to tell you what I saw with my own two eyes. It is a very charged atmosphere, and it's very, very scary when you don't know what to do with it. So there's this one time when these people that lived in a nearby village, this is the wild part. They had asked the witch doctor to come, and the charlatan and a bunch of other, dark magic people to come and fix this problem at their house, and nobody could do it. And so what would happen is they told us every afternoon at a certain time, I think it might have been 4 p.m. I can't remember now exactly what time. There was still daylight when it would happen. These people would be sitting outside under they had like an overhang with a tin roof over it, concrete floor, and their house was surrounded by a 7-foot concrete wall. And the only thing above it was trees. And every afternoon, rocks would fall on their house. I mean, y'all are going to think I'm crazy. I mean, I wouldn't believe this. If you told me this, I wouldn't believe it. So I don't, if you're hearing this and you don't believe it, I don't blame you. But they came to us, they heard that we believed in Jesus. And so they said, can y'all come down here and pray over our house and make this go away? Nobody else can make this stop. So we went down, the pastor and I and the other missionary and some other people I think went. No, actually it was just the three of us. The three of us went. And we went over to their house. It was this little village out in the woods, the bush. And we went in. They opened up their door, their gate, went in. So there's like a wall around their house, like a 7-foot concrete wall. And that's pretty typical in Africa, or at least that part of Africa. We go in and they're very hospitable. You know, they offer us water. And then we came in and sat down under this overhang. It's outside. It's like you'd be on a screened in porch, but no walls, right? It's like almost like an awning, if you will. Tin roof, boards holding up the tin roof, completely solid metal and wood. Okay. Concrete floor. And they said, okay, we're going to sit down and it'll start here in a minute. And we sat there for a few minutes and sure enough, clockwork, we started hearing rocks hit the ceiling or the roof, the tin roof up there. Not only did they hit the tin roof, they went through it. There were no holes in the tin. Like it's solid metal. It's like a tin sheet metal of a roof. And the rocks would fall right onto the concrete right in front of our feet, where our feet were planted on the ground where we were sitting. You heard the sound, and then they landed right in front of. And I mean, I'm listening to myself say this, and I'm like, I'm hardly believing it myself, but that is what happened. And the reason I share this is because this is the kind of environment that Africa is. It is an atmosphere where people readily believe in the supernatural. They know that there are dark forces and bright forces and all this kind of stuff. And I'll be honest with you, that was a very, very scary experience. Even now, like it's only been recently I've been even able to talk about it and not be completely horrified. Like just, it's hard to explain. Like when you experience something like that, it's almost like you were in the middle of a horror movie. So to wrap that story up and get back to the pastor for a minute. So I asked my other friend, Missionary, who was there as well, hey, do you think we should take some of these rocks back to the house with us and just see what happens? Like, we're just kind of curious. What would happen? What are these rocks? What, like, will they be there the next day? Will they disappear? So we did. We took a handful of them back and we set them outside of our house that evening. And the next day they were gone. They had totally disappeared. Now, I don't know if somebody picked them up and threw them somewhere or they just dissolved. I have no idea. Like this is the kind of stuff that I don't have an answer for. I can't give you a logical explanation. It defies logic. It defies physics. It makes no sense. So that's the kind of place that I lived. It was a very, very different type of environment than the United States. But that's all important because this pastor that I worked under leveraged that spiritual dynamic, that supernatural / spiritual, belief system, and he used it to harm people. And he used it to harm me spiritually over a period of months, to where it really left me. I was actually afraid for my life. And so ultimately I ended up coming back to the United States, completely devastated and really not sure what happened to me. And this was at a time when spiritual abuse was not as much talked about, or, there wasn't as much awareness. I remember reading a book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse by I think it's Jeff Van Vonderen, if I'm getting his name right. And that was the first grid I had for spiritual abuse, and started really trying to get my head around what has happened to me. But that experience over there, and I'm leaving out a lot on purpose because I don't want to talk forever, but it was so devastating that I'm still, and this was 18 years ago, and I'm still marked and different because of it. And I don't know if I'll ever fully recover. Maybe I will, not sure. But the damage that the spiritual abuse caused under that pastor was unquantifiable for me. And so, that was a long monologue there, but that was kind of a snapshot of Africa.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, Charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. I have friends who are missionaries in other countries, and some of the stories they tell me, unbelievable. I, like you, think very clearly, think very architecturally minded. I want to know why things work the way they do and how they work. But some of the stories that they tell me, there's just no way that it defies all logic. There's no way that you can explain it. And that's what they experienced. So like I say, I try to figure things out, and I wasn't there, so I can't. But it matches to some extent. I've had experiences with myself that I just can't explain. How did this happen? Why did this happen? I was in a cult, and I was praying to God, but I've learned since that the God that they worship, nothing even resembles Christianity. Right. So was it a different God? I don't know. But there are some questions that I have too that I'm working through. And for now, I just put that on the shelf and I focus on the research. But to the point of the pastor, it's interesting the way that you described that, and I'm glad that you did, because a lot of people will get into a similar situation. They'll endure spiritual abuse, and they leave, and they will think that the group is a cult. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'll let you answer that. But their experience with the leader brands the whole thing. Sometimes it's an entire denomination. I'll never go back to this place. This place treated me like a cult. And all it takes is one bad leader that's appointed into leadership to cause somebody's entire life to change. That's how impactful this can be. Yeah. After we left the cult, we experienced many different churches, and in one of them, there was a pastor that I will never forget some of the things that happened to me. It was very clearly spiritual abuse that they were attempting to do to me. Fortunately, I had just came out of a cult, and I recognized it as they're doing it, and I very quickly put my foot down, and you're not going to do this to me. Yeah. But there are people, because it's a church and because they're trained to respect leadership in churches, there are many people that won't put their foot down, and it can change their lives forever. So I'm glad that you're able to process it, but I understand that's very hard to work through.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's a good point. You can have one bad apple, and it's kind of like the verse in the Bible that says a little bit of leaven will work through the whole lump of dough. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but yeah, I mean, you can have a bad actor, and it doesn't necessarily mean the entire organization is corrupt, but it does beg a lot of questions, like, why is that person or leader continue to allow to operate, especially after the other leaders are notified that the harm occurred? And I did want to add that I did notify the leaders of my organization, All Nations, when this abuse was happening. And there were other allegations that I won't get into now that were quite dark, that involved CSA, that folks came to several of us and told us about. And we raised it with the leaders of the organization in Africa and All Nations in Kansas City. And to All Nations' credit, they did send one of their leaders to Africa to meet to try to work this out. And unfortunately, it was largely ineffectual. The conclusion was I was the one with the problem. This was my fault. It was my fault that I was spiritually abused. That was really the conclusion that All Nations reached. And unfortunately, I came back a complete wreck. I was basically, it was as if I just dropped off the radar. I mean, I had no help, no resources other than one of the leaders came to Africa, which I give him that. That's credit, great. But truthfully, like, I was a complete and utter wreck when I came back, and I just quietly left the organization, and that was that. And there was no care, there was no follow-up, there was no nothing. And to add insult to injury, this pastor ended up moving to the United States, to Kansas City, where he is still now, the last I checked, preaching. He became a leader of a church organization in Kansas City that I was very close to. I knew pretty much all of the people that led that organization. He weaseled his way in to that organization after all of the CSA allegations and after all of the abuse, not just mine, but a lot of other people, worked his way into a church leadership in Kansas City. And I don't know all the details of what happened after that. I just know that publicly he is still, you can find him preaching, preaching in a church. And that was 18 years ago, 16 to 18 years ago when that all went down. And so this is an example of another, really, I would call predator, who has just been allowed to continue to rinse and repeat. And I hope to God he didn't have other victims in the United States. I hope he didn't. But unfortunately, the pattern that we've seen with a lot of the high-profile cases that have come out over the past couple of years is these are not isolated. These are not isolated abuse stories. These are typically patterns of abuse that extend across many decades. And, that was the case with Mike Bickle. It's the case with Robert Morris. And so I'm probably, well, not probably, I know for a fact I'm one of several victims / survivors of this pastor. But he's just, I don't know that anybody held him accountable. And, he was able to get back or move to the United States and somehow be here and continue his harm to people. And so That to me, John, is when you go back to your question on the doctrinal overlaps. I think that is one of the underpinnings that all of these organizations have in common is they categorically will not hold predators accountable, full stop. And so that's one of the reasons you get reiterations and new churches planted and new organizations created and founded by these same people is because they move to another state or another part of the town and create a new organization, and they do the exact same thing again and again and again.
I have a friend who often says that there are people who are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good, or they're so earthly minded that they're no heavenly good. And what he's essentially saying is you must have balance. What I've found in many of these groups, they have great ambitions and they think that they are doing God's work, but they become so focused on God's work that they don't really see the world around them as the world exists around them. And they don't see the people as just people. They see them as tools to further their ambitions in God's work. Many of them, as Bob Scott and I are talking through, many of them have narcissistic tendencies, which is kind of what you're describing this person has. And the sad part about it, what you said is absolutely true. The sad part about it is, once you get up into higher leadership and you see somebody who really has that drive and ambition, you tend to overlook the narcissistic tendencies because they may do more for the quote-unquote kingdom than the average rank-and-file member who doesn't have that same ambition. And so they'll overlook personality traits that are very dangerous and put people in leadership. And when those traits start to abuse people, if they've advanced the quote-unquote kingdom just a little bit, they see the advancement as more beneficial to the body of Christians than they do the actual Christians. And so then what happens is it becomes a religion based on the agenda rather than a religion based on Christ.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's almost like, you know, if you take all of the net positive, so to speak, the quote unquote, like you said, you know, advancing the kingdom, put all that over on one side of the page, and on the other side, like under the pros column, look at all the good stuff they're doing. They're supposedly advancing the kingdom. They are moving heaven and earth, blah, blah, blah. But then on the other side of the page, you have all of the negatives, the cons, as it were. Cons, exactly what it is. It's a con. They're conning people. But you know, if that stuff is hidden, if we as a church just say, well, that's just not as bad as we think it is, and you know, we're just going to kind of wink, wink. He's doing good, and let's just kind of overlook. Love would overlook that is kind of the belief, but that's not true. That's false. Like, love actually cares for the one person that's bleeding out in the ditch. I mean, it's like the Good Samaritan story, and the Good Samaritan story was an indictment upon the church, well, not the church leaders, but the religious leaders of the day during Jesus's time. They were totally offended when he shared that a Samaritan had stopped to help somebody, because the Samaritan was kind of like what they called a half-breed back then. But now the Good Samaritan story is an indictment upon our current church and religious leadership, because the narcissistic leaders are too busy and too important to stop for the one person bleeding out. And what's ironic is, I cannot tell you how often I've heard it taught from like pulpits and stages. Well, Jesus stops for the one, except they don't do that. They don't stop for the one. They are after the crowds. They're after the dollars. They're after the fame. They're after the influence. They're after, you know, anything that advances their ego.
That's right. And it's really sad for the people who've experienced the spiritual abuse, because like I said, and like you said, you never, ever get over it. You always remember this because it's something that you really suffered through. It would be the equivalent if you were to have been in an accident and had some traumatic injury to an arm. You're always going to remember that arm got hurt. Well, this impacts not only your spiritual belief set, it also impacts your psychological being, your well-being.
Yes.
So there are people who are just devastated by this kind of thing. And the leadership who are involved in spiritual abuse, many of them, without having empathy. A narcissist does not have empathy. Without having empathy, they can walk all over people and not even care that they did. And in my opinion, I've voiced this a few times now, but in my opinion, there is no level of advancement for the quote-unquote kingdom that they can do that can offset this. If you have this type of mentality, you're not meant to be a shepherd of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the exact opposite of the kind of people that should be shepherds, who are not putting themselves first, but are putting the people that they lead first, So, for me, back to my experience, like it took me and I still struggle with this. Like I'm very hesitant to trust pastors. I think I have grown in my ability to trust pastors and spiritual leaders, but it's very, very different than it used to be. I used to be a very trusting person, but now I'm like, what's your agenda? I'm like trying to constantly look past what you see at face value and say, what is your end game again? Are you looking to get something out of me? Do you want money? Do you want blind loyalty? Do you want, do you want to be worshiped on the stage? I don't know, but I will say though, it's been cool to run across a few very, very good people, in recent years who are great pastors. They're great, spiritual leaders, and, they're trusting people and trustworthy people and doing a great job leading their churches. And so, I think that most of those are people you'll never hear of. They're not famous. They're just doing the stuff, so to speak, like in their corner of the world. And they're not seeking to, be famous and make a name for themselves. So that's really encouraging. I find encouragement in that.
Yeah, I know a few people who are like that. They don't want their name to be recognized. If something were to happen and they were to be instantly famous, they would just walk away from it. And I'm in this interesting world because of what I do, bringing all of the people together to share their stories. I'm kind of out in the open, but it's the opposite of my personality as well. I just I don't like it. I don't like the public attention. But what I do like is I like watching people who can share their stories with other people who have gone through something traumatic, because all of the listeners who are suffering through similar experiences and can't yet put it into words, when they watch another person who can overcome this and who can start to heal, they too can find healing. So thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. Yes. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org and the Grit and the Wild podcast. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.